Thanks very much for your time, everybody. I'm at the shops and I've got $10 to spend, and I've got to think to myself, what do I want to be? What do I want? Do I want bread or do I want beer? So I've got to think about my situation, okay? So it's lunchtime. I'm going to have a bun. Now, I'd be a bit worried about you if you want a beer at lunchtime. On a day like today, you've got to wait till later. But in my case, at the end of the day, that's when I want a beer. And so if we put ourselves, and that's what gives me happiness. Beer at sunset drinks, bread at lunch. And that's, I guess if we put ourselves into the feet of growers, you know, what will they want to do? Will they want to grow wheat or will they want to grow beer? Sorry, bread or beer, wheat or barley. And so that's what I'm here to talk with you about today. I want to give you information to support growers with decisions on their choice of cereal, wheat or barley, following cereal stubble or canola stubble. So how can I help you to help growers make those decisions on choosing a wheat or barley? So what they really are interested in is profitability. And what are the three elements of profitability? Yield, okay? Yield is king. But costs, that's also another decision that we can help growers with so that they can make the decisions on choosing wheat or barley. And the third element is price. And so today I want to talk you through those three issues and give you information from our research work to help answer those questions so that you can help your growers. As I said, happiness, if we put ourselves into the feet of farmers, it's profit to them. For me, happiness is bread at lunch or beer at sunset drinks. There are three messages that I want you to take away today, and is that barley was higher yielding than wheat at more of the trial sites that we studied this year. That they were responsive, both crops were responsive at either 20 or 40 units of nitrogen. And at the current prices, where barley's around about $300 a tonne, it's actually a more profitable option at suitable sites. So what did we do? As I said, we're talking about profitability. So in 2014, we ran a series of 10 trials across the state. We wanted to do a side-by-side comparison between wheat varieties and barley varieties. So we sowed 6 wheat varieties and 6 barley varieties at 10 locations. 6 of them were on wheat stubble and 4 of them were on canola stubble. And we overlaid on top of that 4 nitrogen treatments, going from 0 to 80 units of nitrogen. Now, as I mentioned, I want to help you with the knowledge to help your growers make profitable decisions. So yield is the first element of the discussion. The next series of graphs is going to show you the responses of wheat and barley varieties to added N at a number of locations. The black dots here are barley sown on wheat, and the white dots is wheat sown on wheat stubble. Now what I've done here, I've actually averaged the production of the barley varieties and the wheat varieties to give a response curve and looking at barley and wheat. This is at Wongan Hills, and it was sown on the 16th of May. So the first thing that you can see, and we noticed it with a majority of the barley varieties, was that they were higher yielding than the wheat varieties at Wongan Hills on this cereal stubble. We had a response to added N at 20 units of N on the barley, and we actually had a response to N at 40 units of nitrogen on the wheat. So in this instance, we've shown that barley has been more productive than wheat. So what happens on the canola stubble? Now these two paddocks were about 1 kilometre away. The soil types are very similar. So up here, we now have our barley responses on the canola stubble, and our wheat responses on the canola stubble. And what you can see here, the first thing that you notice is that barley and wheat were both more productive on the canola stubble than they were on the wheat stubble. We also saw a difference in the response to nitrogen, where we had a response to nitrogen at the 40 units of nitrogen on canola and at 20 units of nitrogen on the, for the wheat on the canola stubble. So that's one location. This is what happened at Benue. We actually had the reverse. So a couple of things to note out of this site is that it was actually a lower yielding site. 1.4 to 1.2 tonnes was the starting yields at 0 nitrogen, compared to about 2 tonnes at Wongan Hills last year. Now at this site, wheat was more productive than barley. This was sown reasonably early on the 9th of May, and the Benue area had a very harsh year. The season was a lot warmer in the summer, and in the winter, and it was a reasonably harsh winter. But in essence, at that Benue site, our wheat production was better than barley. Now moving back to Bunteen, once again we see barley actually being more productive than wheat. When we went out to the 80 units of N, we started to see a plateauing of yield, and we had also noticed that at Wongan Hills as well. As I said, there were 10 sites. At Pingarup, we had a site, we had them not side by side, they were different soil types, but we actually didn't get that plateauing out of yield without increasing N rates from 0 to 80. We did have an increasing response to nitrogen at those sites. But what you can see here is that this is the wheat site, and the barley and the wheats were yielding very similarly at that wheat site at Pingarup, but we started to see a yield difference on the canola stubble. So we saw the barley was more productive on the canola than wheat at Pingarup. So in essence, when we look at the data over those sites, and this is just in 2014, but when we look at the data, there was around about a 10 to 20% yield benefit where we did see a benefit from, where we did see an improved production of barley versus wheat. It was about 10 to 20% higher yielding than the wheat varieties at each of those sites. Okay, so our second element of the discussion is about costs. Now, I'll keep this pretty simple. Costs, one of the big issues one of the issues, I guess, for all commodities, but barley in particular, is actually the freight charges and your ability to deliver. In a case of malt, which is the higher valued crop, having access to bins to deliver. And so I was at the Liebe Trials Day last week, and we were talking about the comparisons of barley and wheat for them. And a lot of the growers would love to be able to grow more barley, but there's a real cost to them because they have to deliver their barley as a malt out to Wongan Hills. And that adds another cost to them. So when you're having these discussions with your growers, you need to be thinking about whether they were looking at feed barley or malt barley and the costs of freight to deliver to the local or to the closest bin. That's most probably the biggest cost. Last year at our trials, we didn't have to apply fungicides in the crops. We didn't have a problem with disease at those sites. We did use seed dressings, but we did that for both wheat and barley. And the other stories that I hear, and your clients might say this as well, is that there's an added cost when you're looking at producing barley. It's a lot more costly for them. But in our analysis, and I'll show you our economic analysis shortly, but in our analysis, our costs for inputs were very similar for wheat and barley. At the bins, it's an extra $1 or so a tonne for the receival standards for receival testing. But it's really most probably from growers' perspective is the cost to deliver. Sorry, just the other thing I want to talk about cost. The other thing about cost, I guess, when you're looking at barley versus wheat is lodging. and head loss and head retention, that's actually a cost to you in your production. And so that's another thing that I guess has to be factored into in that production factor. So the third element of the discussion when we're looking at profitability and the information we want to help growers with is the price and the market that they're going, the receival that they will be able to, or the classification, the segregation that they can deliver to. Because yield is king, but the icing on the cake is getting good quality grain. So what I wanted to just show you here is how added nitrogen had an impact on grain quality. And in this first instance, we're looking at protein with the added nitrogen. So what we have here is the wheat protein on wheat. And you'll see, the first thing that you should notice here is that there was higher protein on the wheat site, at the wheat sites, than there was on the canola sites. And I was at a talk earlier on, and I was looking in the Grow Notes book as well. They talk about the fish, and what you can really appreciate here is that because those wheat sites were lower yielding, in essence you get that protein increase, and that's what we've noticed here. So while you have got reduced yield, you'll end up with added a higher protein, but in essence you get paid more for yield than you do for protein in today's markets. On the canola stubble, proteins were below malt and APW when we had 0 to 20 units of N. And so you needed that added extra N, the extra $27 from 20 units of N to 40 units of N to be able to meet quality grain, to deliver to malt or to deliver to feed. Sorry, malt or to deliver to APW as an example. So that's what happened in the way of protein. What happened in screenings, because that's another parameter that affects grain quality. Last year, we didn't have any influence of nitrogen on grain screenings of wheat. Really low, below market standards. With the added nitrogen, we started to see an increase in screenings for barley. Now, as I said, this is an average, but there were varieties that were going above the 30% and meant that we weren't delivering into malt 1 or malt 2. And they're things that are going to affect the price of the commodity, that's going to affect the profitability of your clients and their businesses. So my appreciation to Blakely, our Seed of Light winner. He got pulled together a whole lot of work and got some economic analysis underway for us, and also thanks to Raj for pulling it together in this graph. What I'm trying to display here is the profitability of the wheat and barley on the two different sites. On the canola stubble and on the wheat stubble. So this is the gross margins, and it's averaged over the 3 sites. So what I should have explained to you is that we had 3 sites in 2014 where we could have those paired comparisons. So at Wongan Hills we had a wheat and canola site side by side, and the soils were similar. The other site that we went to was Cunnaden. The soil types weren't quite so similar, but we had, in essence, a comparison there of wheat and canola the wheat and barley sown on wheat stubble or canola stubble. So that gave us a comparison there. And the third site where we had the paired comparison was down at Pingarup. So what we've done here is just average the responses for those 3 sites on profitability. So this is applied nitrogen and income. And the income has had costs taken out, receivable costs taken out, and freight to the nearest bin. So the key thing that you can see out of here is that on the canola stubble, both barley and wheat were more profitable than they were on the wheat stubble. And what you also can see here is that barley was more profitable than wheat in those 2 scenarios. Now, I'm not advocating that people are going to be going out and growing barley all across the state, because the reality is the soil types and your risk factor to achieving malt or achieving feed are things that you need to consider in profitability and production. So I want to give you a bit of an idea. As I said at the beginning of the talk, barley's prices are pretty strong at the moment. They're about $300 a tonne, and it's been like that for about 6 months. But that's not always the case. And so I just want to show you that the other element to the discussion about profitability is your price and what's happened historically to barley and wheat prices relative to each other. Okay, so I'll just take this in slowly. So this is looking at the price ratio. So this is the price ratio of barley to wheat. So a 1-to-1, or a 1 means that they're both priced the same. A 0.9 would suggest that barley was about 90% of wheat price. So like 270 versus 300, and so on down the track. Okay? And on the y-axis, it's the relative yield needed to offset that increased or decreased price for wheat or barley. Okay, so let's have a little look here. Now we've got a number of numbers here in green and a number of numbers in blue. So the green is that price ratio if we were looking at malt versus APW between 2007 and 2014. So what you can see here is that over the last 7 years, wheat prices have been about 10% better than barley prices in the last 7 years. However, there was a year in 2013 or 2 years previous where barley prices were really, nearly 20% lower than wheat. When we look at the feed barley versus APW, what we see here with the price differential is that feed barley has been anywhere between 90% of wheat and 70% of wheat historically. I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball to know what will be happening into the future, and that's where the marketers will come into play on that, or Blakely might have some knowledge as well. So how can we use this? Okay, so looking at 2014, our price differential is that barley is around about a little bit better or similar to wheat in 2014, malt and APW. So it's a bit better than APW, I should say, but not quite as good as AH. So then the yield of barley could have been a little bit under the wheat yield, and we would have had our break-even yield or a similar profit, I guess. But as I said to you early on, barley this year was about 10 to 20% better than wheat. So that's why we are saying in this year, in 2014, that's why barley was actually more profitable. But you can't always hit malt, and that's the thing that growers struggle with. So if they're going to be delivering to feed, as an example back here in 2009, the price differential was getting down to about 73.73. And so you needed a yield improvement of around about over 30% of the barley, the feed barley, as an example here, to have made it profitable or break even, I guess. And so we didn't see those kinds of yield benefits of barley versus wheat. Our yield benefits were around about 10 to 20%. And so that's why we're seeing at the moment, where the price is so strong for barley, why we're seeing that barley is more profitable. But what will happen next year? Will we be sliding and staying down this end, or will we be sliding back to where we were in 2013? So as I said at the beginning, I wanted to just talk to you about the fact that barley is higher yielding than wheat, was in 2014 higher yielding than wheat at the majority of our sites, or a larger proportion of our sites. They were responsive to added nitrogen at 20 to 40. What we did find was, though, when we had those low rates of N of 0 and 20, the proteins were low and we weren't meeting market segregation, weren't meeting premium markets. But at the moment, when we look at our current prices, we would be saying that barley would have been more profitable than wheat in 2014 at suitable sites. In the north, we have a lot more acid, well, not a lot more, but I mean, there's acid soils are a big issue in the north that I am aware of. And, you know, the tolerance of barley varieties, my understanding, is less on acid soils than wheat. And so that would be one reason why we'll be seeing differences in the production potentially, or the risks to production in those areas. Then I hear some other stories that on the south coast there's a lot of growers that love barley on the south coast because it gives them some kind of an option or well, I guess like frost tolerance. You know, they feel that they have better, its ability to manage frost is better. It has a lower temperature than wheat a lower frost tolerance level than than wheat. Getting a bit confused there, but what we're finding is that there's a large adoption of barley on the southern districts. So look, the call to action for you as advisors and consultants with your clients is to consider firstly the relative yields of barley to wheat. And so the studies that we have shown those relative yields. Just remember that the costs, fungicides are a cost, but also thinking about site selection, thinking about your the soil pH of those sites. The other thing to be thinking about is contamination at harvest, and also about your rotations as well. Freight and lodging are other things that will be impacting on your choices of whether you will be growing wheat or barley. And finally, when we're looking at price, you know, when you're looking at achieving malt varieties or malt segregation, that's where you can start to see the profitability of barley moving ahead of wheat in today's markets. But what are the risks to your clients? What is their ability to achieve malt? Do they have what's their risk profile in that perspective? How much nitrogen are they prepared to apply to get the protein in the screenings up to where it needs to be? Okay, so thanks very much for your time. I just want to point out that this work is a collaboration between the Barley Agronomy Project and the Wheat Agronomy Project. We undertook that last year, and so my colleagues involved in this process in this research program were Blakely Painter, Brenda Shackley, Raj Malik and Mohammed Amjad, and I appreciate their collaboration in this research as well. So thank you very much.